The Gulag Archipelago, Part 2, titled Perpetual Motion, Chapter 1, titled Ships of the Archipelago. This chapter focuses on the transit prisons. Those are the locations where prisoners kept as they're being moved from one place to another, as well as the transport trains that they use to move prisoners from one place to another. Huge amount of logistics goes into this. Quote, "Scattered from the Bering Strait almost to the Bosphorus are thousands of islands of the spellbound archipelago. They're invisible, but they exist. And the invisible slaves of the archipelago who have substance, weight, and volume need to be transported from island to island just as invisibly and as uninterruptedly." End quote. Quote, "All this is happening right next to you. You can almost touch it, but it's invisible, and you can shut your eyes to it too." End quote. As well as the fact of the transport itself, this chapter focuses on to keep regular people ignorant of a lot of what was happening in the prisons. One of the main forms of transport for Soviet prisoners was known as a Stolypin car, or a Zek car. We talked about before, Zek was the nickname for prisoners, short for a Russian word that started out with the first syllable being Zek. These train cars were linked right along with regular passenger train cars, but the civilians on those passenger trains often had no clue that there were prisoners being transported along with them. You can imagine, if you've seen the Harry Potter movies, one of those train compartments. The Stolypin cars, from what Solzhenitsyn describes, had compartments about that size. In the Harry Potter movies, they seat 4 people. In the Gulag, they seat between 14 and 25. They do not have exterior windows, and there are bars on the doors so the guards can look in at any time to monitor the prisoners. Quote, "However, trains really became the favored method of prisoner transport only in the 20s, and it became the universal and exclusive means only from 1930 on, when everything in life became uniform. Therefore, it would be more appropriate to call it a Stalin car rather than a Stolypin car." End quote. Quote, "From the corridor, all this is reminiscent of a menagerie. Pitiful creatures resembling human beings are huddled there in cages. The floors and bunks surrounded on all sides by metal grills, looking at you pitifully and begging for something to eat or drink. Except in menageries, they never pack the animals in so tightly." End quote. Now, as for the crowding and huddling in, I mentioned around 14 to 25 people in one of those rooms. That is just average. Solzhenitsyn knows of one car in particular where 35 people were cramped in. The guards often use their boots to push people in so they have enough room to close the door. In that car where 35 people were cramped in, someone actually died on the way. They had to wait over a day for that body to be removed. Prisoners were kept in these conditions on those trains for several days, often over a week. And Solzhenitsyn stresses this same point for multiple different aspects of the transport in this chapter. Stresses it quite often, quite adamantly. This is not explicitly meant to be a form of torture, it's just circumstance. The prisoners had to be transported somehow, and this is how it turned out. Believe it or not, there were actually punishment cells on those trains, and because there was less cramping in and crowding of the prisoners, those punishment cells were actually considered comfortable by comparison. Another circumstance of this transport that Solzhenitsyn stresses was not intentional torture by design from the higher-ups, was starvation. Quote, "Things are much worse when the convoy comes over and announces, 'We aren't going to be feeding you today.' Nothing was issued for you, and it could very well be that nothing was actually issued. Someone in one or another prison accounting office made a mistake in the figures. Or it could be that it was issued, but the convoy was short on rations, so they decided to snag it for themselves." End quote. The food was very often dried and salted fish, and the food often did not come at the same time as the water. So Solzhenitsyn advises wise prisoners to save the food for the same time that they bring the water, otherwise their mouth will be dry for that whole time, who knows how long. And the water, by the way, was inconvenient for the guards to do because the prisoners did not carry their own cups. They had to carry around a basin of water and ladle it into the prisoners' mouths. You can imagine they were quick and lazy about that. Another reason why the prisoners weren't given food or water as often as they should have been was because bathroom time was a massive inconvenience for the guards. They figured the less often they give them water, the less often they need the toilet. By regulation, only one prisoner was allowed outside for the toilet at a time. In a train car with 100 or so prisoners, you can imagine this held everything up, and that one person, whoever was outside at any given time, got yelled at and called names by both prisoners and guards, constantly told to hurry up. Some of them were told number 1 only. They were beaten on their way running to and from the toilet. Quote, "The toilet was filthy, and tracking back the liquid mess on his shoes, the prisoner would be shoved back into the compartment, where he would climb up over somebody's arms and shoulders, and then from the top row his dirty shoes would dangle into the middle row and drip." End quote. And by the way, they weren't allowed to close the door, not even the women. This toilet ritual took about 2 hours every day, and if the prisoner couldn't wait, too bad. This chapter is the first mention of thieves as opposed to political prisoners, and once again Solzhenitsyn is adamant that a lot of this torture, a lot of these poor conditions, were not intentional from the top down as a means of torture. Quote, "After all, was it because Pilate wanted to humiliate him that Christ was crucified between two thieves? It just happened to be crucifixion day that day. There was only one Golgotha, and time was short, and so he was numbered among the transgressors." End quote. Solzhenitsyn reflects that in imperial times, political prisoners were treated with special care, and they were also rare. They were often held in separate facilities from the regular prisoners. Not so under Stalin. Thieves would routinely steal from the regular prisoners, coats, money, keepsakes, anything. And the political prisoners, the rabbits as they were often called in Volume 1 of this book, they were so conditioned to helplessness that they did nothing about it. Solzhenitsyn explains that the thieves and the prison guards actually had a mutually beneficial relationship. Quote, "It would take a long time for the prisoner to put two and two together and figure out that this horde of devils were hand in glove with the jailers." End quote. Quote, "Up until this point he had assumed incorrectly that his only enemies were the blue caps. He needed more education to come to the understanding that the tattooed chests were merely the rear ends of the blue caps." End quote. As a matter of fact, what they did is they would steal valuables from the prisoners and they would trade those things with the guards in order to get extra food or special treatment or something else. The guards, technically, by regulation, could not steal those things themselves. Well, they could probably get away with it, but there was always that risk of getting in trouble. So the thieves did it, the thieves got away scot-free, and then the thieves handed those things to the guards in exchange for food. Quote, "Although not everyone submitted just like that, 99% of them did in the 30s and 40s, end quote. Quote, "To strike out boldly, one must feel that his rear is defended, that there is solid earth beneath his feet. All these conditions were absent for the 58s. Having passed through the meat grinders of interrogation, the human being was physically crushed in body, but it wasn't only his body. His soul was crushed too. All that was left was a greed for life and no understanding whatsoever," end quote. Quote, "To crush him once and for all, and to cut him off from all others once and for all. That was the function of interrogation for Article 58, end quote. So the innocent political prisoners at the time just had no will to unite against the thieves. They had no willingness to bring weapons onto the train car to defend themselves against the thieves because they knew they would be punished more harshly for it than the thieves. And the 58s by nature are peaceful and law-abiding because they are innocent of any crime. The thieves, on the other hand, are more violent, well-fed, less morals. A small number of thieves can overpower a large number of political. These thieves that got put in the train cars with the political prisoners, they were more well-fed for one. They got to keep their own parcels from home when their loved ones sent them extra food. And in addition to that, they stole food from the 58s. The 58s, by contrast, they got pretty thin. The thieves were frequently let out early, or sometimes they just escaped. Solzhenitsyn gives an example of a man named V.I. Ivanov, who was convicted of Article 162, thievery, 9 times, Article 182, escape, 5 times. He was sentenced to 37 years in total between all those convictions. He only served 5 of them. And on top of this, the guards just viewed the thieves differently from the politicals. The 58s were traitors to the motherland. The thieves, on the other hand, there was a possibility they could reform. The thieves were allowed to organize, the 58s were not. The thieves got much lighter punishments for being caught with weapons in prison. Huge contrast all around. Quote, "And why shouldn't they steal if there was no one to put a stop to it? 3 or 4 thieves could lord it over several dozen frightened and cowed politicals, with the approval of the administration on the basis of the progressive doctrine," end quote. Quote, "Was not taking these things one additional form of the class struggle," end quote. Yes, in 1920s, 30s, and 40s Soviet Russia, the political prisoners were viewed as kulaks or anti-revolutionaries. Therefore, the thieves blatantly stealing from them was tied into this political narrative of class struggle. And then, as I mentioned, the guards who felt entitled to everything that their eyes met would simply trade food rations for the things that the thieves stole. And a lot of times, if there were no thieves in any given Stolypin car, the guards would just steal things themselves right in broad daylight. Solzhenitsyn gives an example of one time the prisoners made an official complaint against the guards once they got to the stopping point. Officially, the guards got in trouble, but Solzhenitsyn doesn't know how that story ends. Quote, "This whole operation wouldn't have worked so well or so thoroughly if it hadn't been for the slow trains," end quote. The prisoners had no idea where the trains were going. Much gossip would be had whenever the prisoners caught a glimpse of a piece of paperwork that one of the guards had. So they would figure out a small piece of information, so-and-so is going to this camp, and then they would try to figure out what kind of general work was in that camp, because a lot of the general work assignments could be fatal because of overworking, poor conditions, freezing, low amount of food, take your pick. And for people on these trains, there was no way to write to their family. Their family would often have no idea where their loved one was. Some people would try to scribble a note on a small piece of paper, and whenever they got an opportunity, they would try to throw it out of the train car and hope that a stranger would pick it up and read the address correctly and get the note to where it was supposed to go. Apparently, a handful of these notes actually did make it. Solzhenitsyn gives the advice to take as few things as possible when you're arrested so you don't have to worry about them. Quote, "The sooner you get used to being without your near and dear ones, and the sooner they get used to being without you, the better it will be, and the easier," end quote. Quote, "You will never return to your former world," end quote. He talks about the thieves, quote, "To them, prison is their native home. Their inner destiny brings them back again and again," end quote. Quote, "Your boots were merely something to lose and win back 5 times in a day at cards," end quote. Quote, "Own nothing, possess nothing. Buddha and Christ taught us this. And the Stoics and the Cynics, why can't we seem to grasp that simple teaching? Can't we understand that with property we destroy our soul?" End quote. And here's where the chapter starts to get philosophical. Quote, "Own only what you can always carry with you. Let your memory be your travel bag. It is these bitter seeds alone which might sprout and grow one day," end quote. Quote, "Look around you. There are people all around you. Maybe you will remember one of them all your life and eat your heart out because you didn't make use of the opportunity to ask him questions," end quote. Quote, "Thin strands of human lives stretch from island to island. They intertwine, touch one another for one night only, in just such a clickety-clacking, half-dark car as this, and then separate once and for all," end quote. Sit down was a common command when moving prisoners from place to place. Solzhenitsyn tells the story of his first encounter with this command. They barked an order at him, sit down. Well, okay, he would sit down. Did he sit down directly on the ground? No, why would he? He put his suitcase on the ground and sat on top of his suitcase. Too late did he notice that he was the only one doing this. An angry guard came over, told him to sit down. Well, he was already sitting down, what do you want? And then the guard kicked the suitcase out from under him. And it was at this point that he realized he was sitting taller than all the other prisoners in that group. In fact, as he would discover, there is a very specific way of sitting down. This has a purpose. It is so the prisoners cannot get up fast. It helps the guards stay in control of the situation. So if the prisoners were to plan to all get up at once and rush the guards, they would need extra time to do that. And as a matter of fact, Solzhenitsyn says that he often looks at the dent on his suitcase where the guard kicked it. At times, normal civilians would look at the prisoners when they were sitting in a group like this, usually in an alleyway. The guards at least tried to keep them in a place where they would be out of sight so they could avoid attention, and they would sit like that when they were waiting for the next train. Quote, "How were they supposed to look at us? With hatred, their consciences don't permit it. After all, few believe that people were imprisoned with cause. With sympathy, with pity, be careful. Someone will take down your name and set you up for a prison term too," end quote. Quote, "Our proud, free citizens drop their guilty heads and try not to see us at all," end quote. Quote, "The old women are bolder than the rest. You couldn't turn them bad. They believe in God. They would break off a piece of bread from their meager loaf and throw it to us," end quote. Quote, "The convoy guards would immediately work the bolts of their rifles, pointing them at the old women, at kindness, at the bread," end quote. Solzhenitsyn remarks that these times when they were sitting, not on a train station, but near a train station, just out of sight of most people, waiting on the next train, he calls it 20 minutes of near freedom. They get to hear the music that's playing at the train station. They get to breathe fresh outdoor air. They get to imagine the people on the train station saying hello and goodbye to each other, maybe even meeting each other with flowers. Quote, cherish such moments, and prison will become easier to bear. Otherwise, you will explode from rage, end quote. Volume 2, Chapter 2, The Ports of the Archipelago. If Part 2, Chapter 1 was about the trains, this part is about the transit prisons. And according to Solzhenitsyn, there was no city without a transit prison, and most prisoners have been to at least 3 of them. Quote, just as all transit prisons are pointless, talk of transit prisons is pointless. And in all probability, this Chapter 2 will be the same. One doesn't know what to take hold of first, what particular thing to talk about, what to lead off with, and the more people are crowded into transit prisons, the more pointless it all becomes, end quote. And indeed, in writing about this chapter, Solzhenitsyn is a bit circular with what he talks about. Starting off with when someone died, they would usually hide the corpse underneath a bed, and keep it there until the body started to stink, so that the survivors could eat the rations assigned to it. These prisons had uncomfortable living spaces, and of course, people crammed in more tightly than you would think humanly possible. Solzhenitsyn describes one transit prison that had 320 people packed into a room that was designed for 20. There was no room to lay down for days and weeks on end. Had to keep your feet tucked under you just because there wasn't enough room to stretch out your legs. Makeshift housing, cages. Prisoner cells that would frequently get waterlogged floors. Often people would have to sleep down there, the water froze at night. When they gave out the food, the prisoners did not have bowls of their own. They often had to use a hat or a pocket of a jacket. They counted the prisoners and distributed the food for every 10 people. So when they brought the food, you and 9 other people had to scramble and eat enough before everyone else ate all that was there. Quote, the imagination of writers is poverty-stricken with regard to the native life and customs of the archipelago. When they want to write about the most reprehensible aspect of prison, they always accuse the latrine bucket. Oh, how frivolous can you be? The actual horror began the moment when there was no latrine bucket in the cell, end quote. And indeed, Solzhenitsyn talks about a time in 1937 when there was a shortage of latrine buckets in Siberia. As he tells it, there were 20 times the prisoners being taken into the region, and the industry of producing these buckets just had not yet caught up. And yet, the prisoners were still only allowed 1 bathroom trip per day. Often they used the hood of a jacket or a boot. Imagine the smell. Solzhenitsyn describes a prison where people were assigned 1 food bowl for every 4 prisoners. And there were times when one prisoner would use that food bowl for a toilet, because of course there was just nothing else to go in. And then sometimes that prisoner would refuse to use their own water ration to wash the bowl clean. Quote, what a conflict, what a clash of 4 personalities. What nuances, and I'm not joking, this is when the rock bottom of a human being is revealed. It is only that Russian pens are too busy to write about it, and Russian eyes don't have the time to read about it, end quote. Solzhenitsyn says that when the prisoners were in the Stolypin cars, they would dream about transit prisons, imagining that these places would be more comfortable than the cars. And as you can see, reality was much different. In these transit prisons, he talks about times where the women's heads were forcibly shaved. And as for showers, there were times when it was hot steaming, it burned the skin, and they forced you to go in. There were times when there was just no water, and the guards would gaslight you and put their hand under the spigot and say, hey, the water's perfect, hop on in. Very often, the guards would make you run naked and barefoot in the snow to and from the bathhouse to retrieve your clothes. And of course, very often the bath attendants, on the men's camps, they would be women, on the women's camps, they would be men. By the way, also medical examinations. Of course, the female doctors saw the men prisoners naked, and the male doctors saw the female prisoners naked. Solzhenitsyn talks about one time seeing the prison chiefs while they were inspecting the transit prison. Quote, if one peers into those snouts, one can picture, with imagination, that they sprang from the same Russian roots as the rest of us, end quote. Who, you may ask, were the bathroom attendants in these prisons? For that matter, who were the barbers, the tailors, bookkeepers? Who did the cooking? Who did the laundry? Who washed the dishes? Glad you asked. You see, the actual prison staff decided that they could just outsource these jobs, collect the wages themselves, or send them home to family members. But the people actually doing the work were socially friendly prisoners. In other words, the thieves, the people who got convicted of non-political crimes, the bitches, as Russian prisoners called them, the turncoats. These thieves would steal from the parcels and mail packages sent to the zeks, the political prisoners. In fact, they would find every opportunity possible to steal from the zeks. When you went to the bathhouse, for example, often you would come back and find articles of clothing missing. Money, if you left that with your clothes, gone. They would sometimes ask you to turn things over for safekeeping. You would never see that again. Quote, the only thing they didn't do is rob us by main force out in the open. End quote. Quote, foolish relatives. They dash about in freedom, borrow money because they never had that kind of money at home, and send you foodstuffs and things. The widow's last mite, but also a poisoned gift because it transforms you from a free yet hungry person into one who is anxious and cowardly, end quote. Anxious and cowardly because of how many people skimmed from the top of that food package, and because of how easy it was to simply have things stolen from you. Quote, O wise gospel saying about the camel and the eye of a needle, end quote. Solzhenitsyn tells a story of one time they're in a crowded cell and all the space on the actual mattresses and beds was taken up. So what do? They climb underneath one of the beds. They figure that's a cozy spot, right? Well, as it turns out, a bunch of juvenile thieves were waiting for someone to do just that. They knew that an adult-sized person crammed under there wouldn't have room to move their arms and legs, so if 4 adolescent bodies came at them all at once, they could steal everything in just a couple seconds and be gone, and that's just what they did. Quote, am I a coward? I had thought that I wasn't one. I had pushed my way into the heat of a bombing and the open steppe. I had remained cool-headed when I led my battery out of encirclement. Why then didn't I grab one of these human rats and grate his rosy face on the black asphalt? End quote. Solzhenitsyn writes with even more detail than Tolstoy about the short, spiritual exchange of words that followed between himself and the leader of this gang of juvenile thieves. As Solzhenitsyn tells it, there were indeed mailboxes and mail going out of the prison. The thing was, there just wasn't paper. Prisoners would find every little bit of scrap paper they could, sometimes wrappers for food and candy. They would scrawl short notes on it, including the address, by the way, as much as they had room to write on such a small piece of paper. And wives and family members, by some miracle, actually found them at the correct transit prison after they got these pieces of paper. The thing was, they were not allowed inside to come visit. He tells about one time there was a prison with a hill overlooking it, and the wife of one of the prisoners, we assume, after getting denied permission to visit her husband, we assume, stood on top of that hill for an extended period of time and looked down into the camp courtyard as they were marching all the prisoners around for their outside time. Quote, there in the abyss among those 300 depersonalized ants, she hoped to catch sight of her man, end quote. Quote, wind was blowing hard up above. It made her long dress, her jacket, and her long hair stream out and billow, expressing all that love and anxiety which possessed her, end quote. Quote, I think that a statue of such a woman, right there on that spot, on the hill overlooking the transit prison, with her face to the gates, just as she actually stood, might explain at least a little something to our grandchildren, end quote. After a long time of her standing there distracting all the prisoners, a guard finally decided to go up there and chase her away. Solzhenitsyn now tells the stories of unique people he met in transit prisons. Quote, even one single eccentric who turns up in your cell can tell you things you will never in your life read about, end quote. There was one time a British prisoner of war, still dressed in his uniform, and a Nazi prisoner of war who had already been in the Gulag system for years, and just never got returned to Germany. Of course, him also still in his uniform, met each other, and the instant they saw each other, quote, they were ready, it seemed, to resort to weapons if they'd had any, end quote. Quote, 5 years had passed since the war, and it had been drummed into us that in the West the war had been waged only for the sake of appearances, and to us it was strange to observe their mutual outrage, end quote. Stalin apparently was looking for people from the West who were willing to denounce capitalism and say that the Soviet system was better. To this end, one Eric Anderson from Stockholm, Sweden got caught up with the Soviets. They captured him in East Berlin when he was visiting a girl. They put him 1 year in solitary confinement with a room full of books written by Marx and Engels. That was part of his re-education. Of course, he was a socialist at the time, but not yet a full-blown communist. Quote, Eric's milky neck and creamy cheeks blushed with indignation whenever we ridiculed Churchill or Roosevelt, end quote. After this year in solitary with those books didn't work, they gave him 10 months in a prison cell with a Soviet officer who they thought would convince him. And even Vyshinsky and Abakumov personally talked to him. But nope, he was stubborn, they could not convert him, so 20 years Gulag. Fun times for Eric Anderson, and this is where he met Solzhenitsyn. Talking about this man from the Western world who found himself caught up in the Soviet Gulag system, Quote, this faith of his in the individual importance of his own fate, among other prisoners' fates, was reminiscent of our own well-intentioned Soviet Orthodox communists. End quote. He truly did believe that Western governments would go out of their way to arrange a prisoner exchange just for him. Quote, likely he still thought his life could be saved, which is only human, like millions of other rabbits in this book. End quote. Quote, he thought he would be imprisoned for a while, and then the indignant West would free him. He did not understand the strength of the East, and he did not understand that such a witness as himself, who had displayed such firmness of will unheard of in the soft West, could never be released. End quote. Solzhenitsyn takes pains in more than just this chapter, by the way, to talk about how enriching the stories of individual people who you find yourself in prison with are. Quote, this coming and going of people, these destinies, and these stories greatly enliven the transit prisons, end quote. Sometimes when they were in the transit prisons, the new prisoners would get to talk to some of the veteran prisoners. What kinds of things would they tell them? Quote, the food is sparse, but the sleeping is good, end quote. The veterans would emphasize the importance of actually getting to rest rather than work while you're in the transit prison, despite how bad so many aspects of the transit prison are. Quote, only those who know what general assignment work is in the camps will understand that a transit prison is a rest home, a happiness on our path, end quote. Now, where do the prisoners go after the transit prisons? How does that even get determined? I am so glad you asked. Solzhenitsyn describes rooms full of messy, disorganized case files strewn about the floor every which way. These case files needed to be sorted through, and the paperwork needed to travel with the prisoner. Who gets to sort it all out? Oh, the thieves, of course. And which camps are the good ones and which are the bad ones? Well, darn if the prisoners know. Quote, the fact that the prisoner's whole future depended on such another prisoner, with whom one ought to find some chance to talk, even if via the bathroom attendant, and whose hand one ought perhaps to grease, even if via the storage room keeper, was worse than if his fortunes had simply been determined blindly by the roll of fate, end quote. Quote, most blessed of all were those who had nothing to give or who spared themselves all that anxiety, end quote. Quote, submission to fate, total abdication of your own will in the shaping of your life, recognition that it was impossible to guess the best or the worst ahead of time, but that it was easier to take a step you would reproach yourself for. All this freed the prisoner from any bondage, made him calmer, even ennobled him, end quote. Now, apart from the mess of all the paperwork getting sorted out, they also had to worry about thieves, figuring out which prisoners had the shortest terms. You can talk to those people, ask them their name, where they're from, when they were born. You know, mother's maiden name, numbers on the back of your credit card, stuff like that. Yeah, the thieves would try to impersonate those people, wait until their name was called, then the thief would jump up, and the poor person getting impersonated, if they weren't paying attention or if they were just asleep, oh, they would miss out. They would have to wait for months in the transit prison before they even figured out that their case paperwork was missing, and they would be accused of being the person who stole their identity. And funny enough, if you could believe it, quote, there were also eccentrics who sold their short terms for a kilo or two of fat bacon. They figured in any case the authorities would check up and establish their correct identities, and sometimes they did, end quote. And as if these transit prisons couldn't get any worse, quote, human nature, if it changes at all, changes not much faster than the geological face of the earth, and the very same sensations of curiosity, relish, and sizing up, which slave traders felt at the slave girl markets 25 centuries ago, of course possessed the Gulag bigwigs at the Uzman prison in 1947. And quote, a couple of dozen men in the NVD uniform sat at several desks covered in sheets of paper. This was for their self-importance, it would have been awkward otherwise. And all the women prisoners were made to undress in the box next door and walk in front of these men barefooted and bare-skinned. Turn around, stop, and answer questions, end quote. Quote, drop your hands, they ordered those who adopted the defensive pose of classic sculpture. After all, these officers were very seriously selecting bedmates for themselves and their colleagues, end quote. Apparently, they actually called them merchandise. Now, what advice did the Gulag veterans have for the newcomers who they met in these transit prisons? Quote, in camp, no one ever does anything for nothing. No one ever does anything out of the generosity of his heart. You have to pay for everything. If someone ever proposes something to you that is unselfish, Disinterested, you can be sure that it is a dirty trick." End quote. Quote, "The main thing is avoid general assignment work. Avoid it from the day you arrive. If you land in general assignment work on that first day, then you are lost. And this time for keeps." End quote. According to these veteran prisoners, 80% of prisoners end up on general assignment work. Quote, "Doing this work, you expend the last of your strength. And you are always hungry, and you are always wet and shoeless, and you are given short rations and short everything else." End quote. Part 2, Chapter 3, The Slave Caravan. This chapter is mostly about transportation from the transit prison to the final destination, which is the camp. Red trains were most often used. The Stolypin cars could not go to any place besides a transit prison, but the red trains could go anywhere in Russia that had train tracks, even if that place was completely uninhabited. And if the train could not take them all the way to where they wanted to go, they would often march the prisoners by foot. Solzhenitsyn mentions that the red trains had a big part in populating the Kolyma. That is the far, far eastern region of Russia, where, if you remember, they had all the gold mines. The 1930s was when that place got populated. Quote, "The red trains can go into emptiness, and wherever one does go, there immediately rises, right next to it, out of the sea of the steppe or the sea of the taiga, a new island of the archipelago." End quote. These red trains had no beds and no bunks. Quote, "Whoever can, in imagination, lie there, like them, and survive those 18 to 20 hours can indeed survive." End quote. These train cars were constructed of wooden planks. There was a single drainage hole in it for bathroom use, and of course there were platforms for guards to stand on with machine guns. Before the train trip, they would check all the planks for structural integrity. These trains were equipped with searchlights, of course. Solzhenitsyn mentions that there were 25 train cars on each of these trains, and standard was for that to carry 1,000 prisoners. So that's an average of 40 people per train car. Quote, "Everyone knew, of course, that arrests were being made every day and every hour, but no one was to be horrified by the sight of large numbers of them together." End quote. Quote, "This wasn't your little group from a Stolypin that could be led right past the townspeople." End quote. Because these trains moved such a large number of people, 1,000 every train trip, they did whatever they could to keep it private from the public. It was standard procedure to only load the trains and start them off at night. Quote, "In Orel in 1938, you could hardly hide the fact that there was no home in the city where there hadn't been arrests. And weeping women in their peasant cars blocked the square in front of the Orel prison, just as in Sudakov's painting, The Execution of the Streltsy." End quote. Quote, "True, the women realized. They somehow found out, and at night they came to the station from all over the city and kept watch over the trains on the siding. They ran along the cars, tripping over the ties and rails, and shouting, 'Is so-and-so in there? Is so-and-so in there?' End quote. And a few of these people apparently actually did find their husbands before they were shipped off. The Soviets did soon find a way to deal with the women who were coming up to the sides of the prison trains and trying to find their husbands. Quote, "These scenes, unworthy of our contemporary world, testify only to the then inept organization of train embarkations. The mistakes were noted, and after a certain night the trains were surrounded by cordons of snarling and barking police dogs." End quote. These searchlights on these trains had a clear and important purpose. Quote, "Clear hostile searchlight beams not only provided light, but were an important theatric element in terrorizing prisoners, along with yells, threats, and gunstock blows on those who fell behind." End quote. Quote, "The main thing was to undermine, to crush the prisoner's willpower, so he wouldn't think of trying to escape, so that, for a long time, he wouldn't notice his new advantage. The fact that he had exchanged a stone-walled prison for a railroad car with thin plank walls." End quote. The goal of the prison guards here was to disorient the prisoners as much as possible, to prevent any attempt at escape. And because they're moving such a large number of people at once, everyone needs to be counted, recounted, everyone needs to be searched and searched again. In many cases, their hair needs to be cut. Prepping these prisoners began the morning before. Quote, "Thus for the prisoner the loading at night was only a relief after a whole day of torment." End quote. As part of the searching process, as the prisoners were getting on these trains, they took all types of powder, string, straps, up to and including the straps that held on the false limbs of amputees. They took any kind of suitcase, saw, anything that could be used for prying. More than just for prison security, the mentality there was taking valuables from enemies of the people for the use of the people. Quote, and when at dusk the last truck leaves the prison yard with the prisoners, they see the convoy guards rushing to grab the best leather suitcases from the pile, and select the best cigarette cases from the barrel. And after them, the jailers scramble for their booty too, and last of all, the transit prison trustees, end quote. This after the prisoners were told that their things would be stored for them and returned to them. As part of the whole dehumanize disorient thing, the prisoners were told to strip. Quote, in these statutory orders of the convoy lay the basic power one could not argue with. After all, a naked person loses his self-assurance. He cannot straighten up proudly and speak as an equal to someone who is still clothed, end quote. And so the prisoners, under watch of searchlights and police dogs and everything else, had to carry their clothes with them instead of wearing them. And of course, once they got on the train cars, they shared those cars with, you guessed it, thieves. Any type of clothing that was warm for the winter got stolen. They would also take the best of the food. As a matter of fact, it was not always guaranteed that the train would have enough food for the entire journey. The thieves always got to eat first, and they always got to eat best. They would also take whatever valuables the guards missed when they were searching, and sometimes this even included gold teeth, which they would rip right out of people's mouths. These train cars did not have heating, and in addition to not having enough food, they often did not have enough water. And to make things even more annoying, the prison guards would frequently stop the train, and regularly they would be required to ensure the structural integrity of the train cars, make sure that the prisoners didn't rip any of the planks off of the train cars in order to try and escape. So they would enter the train cars with wooden mallets, move all the prisoners to one side, knock on all the planks on the wall to make sure that they didn't move, and then move all the prisoners to the other side and knock on all the planks on the other wall to make sure that they were not loose. And 40 people packed into one train car, if any of the prisoners were in the way or if they were slow, just hit them on the ribs with a wooden mallet, no big deal. Each car would of course have stool pigeons, you might remember. Those are prisoners who are on the payroll of the prison itself. They are put there to inform on the other people in the prison, and because of the extreme heat in summer and cold in winter, frequently people died on these trains. Now, the unlucky prisoners were transported in open, flat cars. That means they were exposed to the rain whenever it rained. And of course, water, what do we know about water? In the cold, it freezes. Now, because these cars had no walls, there was a risk of falling off the side. One might think this would be a good way to escape, but often prisoners who fell off the side were crushed by the train wheels. And of course, the thieves got the best places to sit on these open flat cars, which was directly in the middle, least risk of falling off. And then whenever the train stopped when it got wherever it was going, the prisoners were usually ordered to sit down in the snow, in the freezing cold with their inadequate winter clothing, and be counted, and then often they would have to march for miles to their final destination, on foot. There was one particular group of prisoners. The train stopped, they were unloaded, they were counted. They were marched for a few miles to the camp location. Luckily, there was already a little bit of a camp set up. So they were taken there, they were taken through the bath routine, which, if you remember the stories from the transit prisons, where they were told to run naked through the snow to the bathhouse and leave their clothing in a separate building. Yeah, same thing here, run naked through the snow. And on occasion their things went missing, yada yada. After the bath, they got dressed again, and then they realized the camp did not yet have enough beds. So they marched them back those few miles again, and they had to sleep on the train. Quote, and this, after all, was an episode with a happy ending. In this case, the camp at least existed. If it couldn't accept them today, it would tomorrow. It was not at all unusual for the red trains to arrive nowhere, and the end of the journey often marked the opening day of a new camp. They might simply stop somewhere in the taiga under the northern lights and nail a sign to a fir tree. End quote. Quote, if a camp had been set up there even 2 weeks earlier, that would have spelled comfort. Hot food would have been cooked. End quote. Quote, gradually the economy of the archipelago prospered. New railroad branch lines were built, and soon they were transporting prisoners by train to many places that had been reached only by water not long before. End quote. And sometimes the prisoners did in fact travel by river barge. Quote, prisoner transport by barge on the northern Divina and on the Vishegda had not died out even by 1940. Prisoners in the hold stood tightly jammed against each other, and not just for a day either. They urinated in glass jars which were passed from hand to hand and emptied through the porthole. And anything more substantial went right in their pants." End quote. These river barges that transported prisoners, of course, had no medical assistance available. Some of them had latrine barrels, yes, huge barrels. And of course these were located below deck, and when they were full they needed to be lifted above deck. You can imagine someone carrying a huge heavy barrel like that. Things tended to spill. And often that spillage would seep between the deck boards and drip down onto the prisoners. These trips by barge often took a month, and there was often not enough food, and of course there were thieves here as well who stole the rations. Thieves here, of course, also stole many other things from the prisoners. They would play cards to figure out who got those stolen goods, and then, if you remember how things went on a Stolenpin car, the thieves would trade those stolen guards to the prison guards and in exchange get extra food. There were times when the Zeks tried to resist having their things stolen from the thieves, but not very often. Quote, "There was one political incident on the voyage. The steamers had to pass through La Perouse Strait, very close to the Japanese islands. And at that point, machine guns disappeared from the watchtowers and the convoy guards changed to civilian clothes. And access to the deck was forbidden." End quote. Quote, "According to the ship's papers, they were transporting not prisoners, but volunteers for work in the Kolyma. A multitude of Japanese small craft and boats hovered about the ships without suspecting." End quote. Imagine that. Apparently there was another ship that had a fire very close to that spot in the water. The captain refused multiple offers of help from the Japanese. And what did they do? They just kept the deck closed the whole time so the prisoners could not get up, and many of the prisoners ended up suffocating because of the smoke underneath the deck. Just dump the bodies into the ocean and keep on going. After these prison barges arrived at their destination in far eastern Siberia in the Kolyma, of course the standard drill, go to the shower, leave your clothes behind, and they would never see their clothes again. They were given fresh new prison outfits. And the guards would try to gaslight them, telling them, "Oh, you left your things all the way back home." Quote, "Here in camp we have communism and things are held in common." End quote. Quote, "But I am beginning to repeat myself, and this will be boring to write and boring to read, because the reader already knows everything that is going to happen ahead of time. They would be trucked hundreds of miles and driven dozens of miles more on foot. On arriving, they would occupy new campsites and immediately be sent out to work. And they would eat fish and flour, chased down with snow, and sleep in tents. Yes, it was like that." End quote. There was one time where prisoners were made to march 15 miles, and a dozen people died during that march. There were times where prisoners had to catch fish using their trousers as nets in the river, and eat the fish alive. If a prisoner could not keep up during the march, if he walked slowly or fell down, they would leave the prisoner behind with a single guard to watch him. And then, a little bit later, you would see that single guard coming back to the rest of the group without the prisoner. So what happened? Where's the prisoner? Did they set him free? Nope, he got shot. Quote, "And no one is going to write a great novel about it, not even one chapter. If you live in a graveyard, you cannot weep for everyone." End quote. Gulag Archipelago, Part 2, Chapter 4, From Island to Island. The chapter starts out talking about special convoys, which are different from the Stolypin cars, the red cars, the caravans. And at first the reader gets the impression that the special convoys are the main focus of the chapter. But no, it's something more, and I'll get into it and I'll tell you the story piece by piece the same way Solzhenitsyn told it. So, special convoys, they are rare, and the prisoners who travel in these convoys have much, much fewer restrictions on where they can go, what they can do, what they can say, than standard bulk transport of prisoners. One of the main reasons being they are transporting one prisoner at a time, usually. And also they are transporting prisoners under special conditions, sometimes VIPs. He tells the story of one jailer telling a prisoner on a special convoy he had permission to go out on the town and then return to the jailer's home, and in the morning the jailer would get going and take him with him. Imagine coming from a Gulag prison camp and hearing that you can just go out on the town for a night. In Solzhenitsyn's case, when he traveled by special convoy, it was because he was a VIP. How did he get to be a VIP, you ask? Well, at the camp intake, they have you fill out a form, and one of the questions on this form is asking about your profession. Well, all the prisoners know that if you write down something valuable to the camp or to the government, they are more likely to take you somewhere else or give you special treatment. A lot of people wrote down that they were barbers, tailors, shopkeepers, bakers, etc. Army officer Alexander Solzhenitsyn wrote down that he was a nuclear physicist. And the Soviet government believed him, so they took him, by special convoy, out of the Gulag camp and back to Moscow to the Bochirki prison. The prisoners talked about there being paradise islands, that is, islands in the archipelago, where the only work is mental work. And Solzhenitsyn was destined to find out what that was like. The main thing Solzhenitsyn noticed while traveling by special convoy was how superficial the people from freedom all around him were while he was traveling. Quote, "In the deep death stillness of midnight, the doors of the death cars are being swung open and people are being dragged out to be shot. On all the railroads of the country this very minute, right now, people who have just been fed salt herring are licking their dry lips with bitter tongues. They dream of happiness, of stretching out one's legs, and of the relief one feels from going to the toilet, and you have the right to arrange your own life under the blue sky and the hot sun, to get a drink of water, to stretch, to travel anywhere you like without a convoy. So what's this about unwiped feet, and what's this about a mother-in-law?" End quote. The conversation about first world problems, or in this case second world problems, happening all around Solzhenitsyn while he's traveling on the train drive him nuts. He daydreams about what he would like to say to all these people around him. Quote, "What about the main thing in life, all its riddles? If you want, I'll spell it out for you right now. Do not pursue the illusory, property and positions. All that is gained at the expense of your nerves, decade after decade, and is confiscated on one fell night." End quote. Quote, "The bitter doesn't last forever, and the sweet doesn't fill the cup to overflowing. It is enough if you don't freeze in the cold, and if thirst and hunger don't claw at your insides." End quote. Quote, "Who should you envy, and why? Our envy of others divides us most of all." End quote. Quote, "Rub your eyes and purify your heart, and prize above all else in the world those who love you and who wish you well. Do not hurt them or scold them, and never part from any of them in anger. After all, you simply do not know. It might be your last act before your arrest, and that will be how you are imprinted on their memory." End quote. Solzhenitsyn is thinking about saying all this, but he must consider, quote, "But the convoy guards stroke the black handles of the pistols in their pockets, and we sit there, 3 in a row, sober fellows, quiet friends." End quote. The convoy guards told Solzhenitsyn to act normally while on a civilian train surrounded by civilians. Quote, "The cars are full, well, full in free people's terms. No one is lying under the benches, and no one is sitting on the floor in the aisles. I was told to behave naturally. I had been behaving very naturally indeed. I noticed a seat beside a window in the next compartment, and I got up and took it. There were no empty seats for my guards in that compartment. They sat where they were and kept their loving eyes on me from there." End quote. When he's in this compartment, a stranger in the train offers him a beer. Solzhenitsyn notices that this stranger has a suitcase that was clearly made in a prison camp. So he strikes up a conversation with him and finds out that this stranger is an NVD officer, a prison guard, who had evidently gotten that suitcase by trading it with the thieves in the camp who had prior stolen the suitcase from one of the Zeks. Quote, "Earlier in the semi-darkness he had noticed I was wearing some kind of semi-military overcoat and a field shirt, but now devil only knew what I might be. Maybe I was a police agent. Maybe I was out to catch escapees. Why was I in this particular car, and he had criticized the camps there in my presence?" End quote. So in that social engineering sort of way, the prison guard was actually scared of the Zek, who he didn't know was a Zek. Quote, "And after spending a few hours among free people, here is what I feel. My lips are mute. There is no place for me among them. My hands are tied here. I want free speech. I want to go back to my native land. I want the archipelago." End quote. And I thought about this recently. I thought about what would happen if I traveled to a place where they didn't have the Charlie Kirk shooting, they didn't have all this Antifa stuff, all this trans stuff, where instead of Black Lives Matter, they had real struggles for real humanitarian crises. Or perhaps they had not many struggles at all and it would be more like an 80s or a 90s United States. How would I even go about talking to someone from that kind of culture? Someone would hear me take like a moral stance on something that I'm absolutely convicted on because I've lived it. And they would be like, "Oh, that's not polite." Like, is this how returning veterans feel when they go back to civilian life? Like, if that happened, I might go on a rant about things I've seen firsthand. Like, I can relate to Solzhenitsyn here. At this point in the chapter, he has sort of an ode to Bochirki prison, segment in it, and he notes that the prisoners lovingly refer to it as the Butyrki Health Resort. Because all these rich people out in civilian life, no troubles in the world, they actually pay money to go to health resort camps and get these professional weight loss programs. But prisoners in the Butyrki, amazing weight loss, 100% success rate, guaranteed. Quote, I shall be taken to a cell that are 2 domes with a hanging arch in the middle, with 2 large windows, and a large combination table and cupboard, and I shall be greeted by strangers, who are certain to be intelligent, interesting, friendly people, and they will begin to tell me their stories, and I will begin to tell them mine, and at night we will not even feel like going off to sleep right away, end quote. Quote, I am the interstellar wanderer. They have tightly bound my body, but my soul is beyond their power, end quote. At the conclusion of Solzhenitsyn's journey in that train car, he leaves a postcard behind on purpose, pretending to forget it, knowing that whoever goes through and cleans up the trash in the train is likely to see that it's a piece of mail and take it to a mailbox, which, of course, as a Zek, he doesn't have as much access to. And then when they got to Moscow, amusingly, you'll remember the story from Solzhenitsyn's arrest. When the guard was not from the city, Solzhenitsyn had to help them navigate to the prison. Well, same thing here. The special convoy guards were not familiar with Moscow. Solzhenitsyn actually had to guide them to the Butyrki prison once again. Yeah, we get on this train, and then we get off at this stop, then we go to this street. Imagine you get arrested and you had to do that for the cops. Like, wow. When he sees the outside of the Butyrki prison, he is actually eager to get back. At this point, it is July of 1946. Solzhenitsyn gives some estimates. Official reports say that there are between 15 and 20 million prisoners in the Soviet Gulag system at this time. Solzhenitsyn says there's about 12 million at any given time, and about half of them, he estimates, are politicals, so that puts the number around 6 million. That is the population of a small nation. And Solzhenitsyn loves meeting new people from this nation that is an entire sub-nation of the Russian nation. He loves entering a new cell for the first time and excitedly greeting the people there and getting to know their stories. And in this chapter, he tells a lot of stories of his cellmates from this time and place. And notably, he's able to recount the story of someone he never met, that is a former aviator, named Mahokkin. Famous enough to have an island named after him, but then he was arrested on 5810, and they did not change the name of the island because all the maps were already drawn. Solzhenitsyn writes about the fact that he knows so much about someone's life who he never met. Quote, this was not information I needed, but I had remembered it all, end quote. Quote, now this is the prisoner's telegraph system. Attentiveness, memory, chance meetings, end quote. And in this whisper-down-the-line sort of way, relatives and friends would be able to hear indirectly from and about each other. Maybe a few months or years separated, but still. And those are touching meetings when Solzhenitsyn describes it. He describes a hot summer that summer when he stayed in the Butyrki again. He described the latrine barrels smelling worse because of the heat, poor ventilation in the rooms, and he describes eagerly getting to conversation with his cellmates in that first cell, cell 75. Quote, it turns out that 2 different waves had met in the cell. The ordinary wave of freshly sentenced prisoners being sent off to camp, and a reverse wave of camp inmates, who were all technical specialists, all being sent to unknown destinations, to some sort of scientific research institutes, end quote. And it appears that Solzhenitsyn telling the Soviets that he was a nuclear physicist had actually worked by some miracle. And one of his cellmates was a man named Rizovsky. He was a famous biologist sent to a German university for research in 1936, refused to come back to Russia when they called him back, and then in 1945, when the Russians took over East Germany, the NVD finds him and they take him back home. He was sentenced to 10 years. He was one of the most qualified, but others in that cell 75 had varying levels of qualification. This Rizovsky called himself the president of the Scientific and Technical Society of Cell 75. In this cell 75, of course, it was full. Solzhenitsyn had to sleep underneath a bunk. Quote, even the prison administration had never thought to have prisoners sleep under there, end quote. And the way to get under there, it was so short they would have to lay on their stomach and shimmy underneath and then have one of their cellmates pass them their jacket. Quote, but I was happy, there on the asphalt floor in a dog's den under the bunks, with dust and crumbs from the bunks falling in our eyes. I was absolutely happy, without qualification. Epicurus spoke truly. Even the absence of variety can be sensed as satisfaction, when a variety of dissatisfactions has preceded it, end quote. Quote, after camp, which already seemed endless, and after a 10-hour workday, with cold, rain, and aching back, oh, what happiness it was to lay there for whole days on end to sleep, and nevertheless to receive 1.5 pounds of bread and 2 hot meals a day. In a word, the Boutier Health Resort, end quote. I see people make memes about the excerpt from the one Marcus Aurelius writing, where he talks about being a sleepy boy. Well, this part of this chapter reminds me of that. Quote, to sleep was so important, to lie there on one's belly, cover one's back, and just to sleep. When you were asleep, you didn't spend your strength, nor torment your heart, and meanwhile your sentence was passing. When our life crackles with sparks like a torch, we curse the necessity of spending 8 hours uselessly in sleep. When we have been deprived of everything, when we have been deprived of hope, then bless you 14 hours of sleep, end quote. Quote, they kept me in that cell 2 months. I slept enough to make up for the past year and the year ahead, end quote. In that cell 75, they had a 20-minute walk every day that they never refused, even in bad weather. They would read books, which, of course, there was a waiting list for them. There were only so many books per prisoner. Fewer books in the cell than the number of prisoners, actually. They would play chess with each other. They would talk and get to know each other. They would have political debates. Solzhenitsyn, as a matter of fact, at this point, still called himself a Marxist. They got to meet a large number of POWs from Europe and émigrés from China and from Europe. If you remember the story from Solzhenitsyn's arrest, the guy that he had carry his suitcase for him, Solzhenitsyn meets that very same guy again. Quote, the old man smiled at me. He recognized me too, and even seemed pleased by our meeting. He had forgiven me. He had been sentenced to 10 years, but certainly didn't have that long to live, end quote. Touching conclusion to that story. I was a little surprised at the fact that they had German POWs in with the Soviet political prisoners. That would be a little weird. If you grew up in America, you commit a crime, you get sent to a normal prison, and then there's like a Taliban dude in there with you. But from what Solzhenitsyn writes, they seem to have gotten along at least reasonably well. All the prisoners, to pass the time, they would compose and read poetry to each other, they would recite lectures to each other. They would argue like they did before about which class of criminals, which subsection of Article 58, were the true traitors to the motherland. Quote, even before the war, when I was studying at 2 higher education institutions, and at the same time earning my way through, by tutoring and striving to write too, even then I had not experienced such full, such heart-rending, such completely filled days as I did in Cell 75 that summer, end quote. The prison church building, as Solzhenitsyn writes, was shut down, and instead that was used as a sort of temporary housing for prisoners. He describes it as an intra-transit prison for the Butyrki. He describes 2,000 prisoners being kept in there. Quote, despite their meager means, relatives made a special effort to provide parcels in those last days before the prisoner transports left. The families had had no prison education themselves, and they never got any good advice from the prison reception office either, and therefore they didn't send plastic dishes, the one and only kind the prisoners were allowed to have, but glass or metal instead, end quote. Quote, all these honeys, jams, condensed milks were pitilessly poured or scraped out of their cans through the swill trough in the cell door into whatever the prisoner had. And in the church the prisoner had nothing at all, which meant that he simply got it in the palms of his hands, in his mouth, in his handkerchief, in the flaps of his coat, which was quite natural in Gulag terms, but not in the center of Moscow, end quote. Quote, and at the same time the jailer kept hurrying him as if he was late for his train. The jailer hurried him because he was counting on licking out whatever was left in the jars, end quote. Quote, in the church cell, you celebrated the ritual of getting adjusted to the fact that your sentence had been handed down, and it was not in the least a joke. To the fact that no matter how cruel the next era of your life might be, you would nevertheless digest and accept it, and you arrived at that with great difficulty, end quote. Quote, you had no permanent cellmates here, as you had in the interrogation cells. Day and night, people were brought in and taken away, singly and by tens. And as a result, the prisoners kept moving along the floor and along the bunks, and it was rare to lie next to any one neighbor for any 2 nights, end quote. It was in this place that Solzhenitsyn met a Romanian spy. This guy had grown up in Romania. He knew how dangerous, how risky it was spying in the Soviet Union because everybody suspected everybody else. But he did it anyway, and furthermore, he thinks he did a decent job at it. He was captured and sent to interrogation, of course. While he was in prison, that was the time when Romania was annexed by the Soviets. So the interrogator showed him the newspaper, and he said it might have been a forgery. He showed him an official order from the Romanian government for the spies to stop all their operations and surrender to the Soviets. He thought that was a forgery. Finally, they had to get his commanding officer in the interrogation room to tell him firsthand to surrender and cooperate with the Soviets. He did. They didn't even give him a trial. They just gave him a Gulag sentence. Quote, "In this whole long prisoner's chronicle, we will not again meet such a hero. It was the only encounter of the sort I had ever had in all my 11 years of prison, camp, and exile, and others didn't even have one, and our mass circulation comics tried to dupe young people into believing this was the only type of people the organs catch. It was enough to look around that church cell to grasp that the youth itself was who the organs were catching in the first place." End quote. Solzhenitsyn leaves off talking about how coming back to the Moscow prisons after camp and seeing people who were newly arrested, it gave him a different impression of where things were going. Quote, "Our generation would return having turned in our weapons, jingling its heroes' medals, proudly telling its combat stories, and our younger brothers would only look at us contemptuously." End quote. Quote, "The war had ended, and we could allow ourselves the luxury of arresting everyone who was singled out. They were no longer needed as soldiers." End quote. And finally, quote, "Good Lord, how could we have missed the main point of the whole thing? While we had been plowing through the mud out there in the bridgeheads, back home another generation had grown up and gotten moving. But hadn't it started moving in another direction, in a direction we wouldn't have been able or wouldn't have dared to move? But they weren't brought up the way we were." End quote. More on this in future volumes of the book.